Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Adventure Build. My name is Kelly.
I'm Trevor.
Today we are going to install a brand new Ironman 4x4 full replacement suspension kit on my brother's 2018 Toyota 4Runner.
TRD off-road.
TRD off-road. So do you want to go over what this kit involves and what it's all about?
So this is the Ironman 4x4 Foam Cell Pro suspension, stage 2. We go from the rear shocks, rear springs, to the front coilovers that are pre-built from Ironman, and we also have the upper control arms. And we also have the front sway bar relocation kit.
All right guys, so now we have the suspension laid out. We're gonna pull in the 4Runner into the amazingly clean garage that just got new lighting put in. And we're going to get everything tore apart and we're gonna put this thing all in. Let's get this done.
Woohoo! High five. First thing, make sure you hit your parking brake. So now that we got it up on jack stands, we can remove all the nuts completely. Now remove the tire. And definitely put the tire underneath for safety.
So the tire being under the truck, all that's gonna do is if something were to fail, like one of the jack stands, or we pushed it so much that it actually came off the jack stands, the tires being under the center of the vehicle would basically just stop us from getting crushed. Because nobody wants to get crushed while they're doing an install.
But one of the first steps once we get it all jacked up is to remove the front skid plate so we can get to the front sway bar.
We actually didn't have to take the skid plate off because the way that the skid plate is, there's plenty of space to get to the front sway bar mounts. So we're just gonna break these loose, drop them down and reinstall the spacer kit to make more room for the larger diameter front shocks.
So while Trevor is working on the sway bar, getting the new drop installed, I am disconnecting the sway bar completely. That way that the lower A-arm and the spindle can drop freely and get full flex so we can get everything out of here we need to get out. So I'm using the breaker bar here to get this thing broken. Oh, and that one just pops out. Usually I would have to put the bolt on backwards, give it a whack with a rubber dead blow mallet and push it right through, but this one just popped right out. Sweet. And to keep the sway bar out of the way, I've attached a bungee cord here, basically to the front hook on the bumper, which will just keep it out of the way from getting involved in all of this going on. So all you do is you put the tool in, get behind it, and it just pops right out. So now these are out of the way, we can get to disconnecting the everything connected to the spindle, the ABS line and the brake line, just so that we can have more movement with the spindle once we get everything undone. So I'm using a 12mm wrench to remove the ABS brake line. So detach the bracket and then I put the bolt right back in as to not lose it. So now I'm going to use a 10mm wrench and loosen up the bracket that holds this part of the sensor onto the upper control arm. So now with the spindle loose and freely able to move, you don't want this to be able to tilt too far forward. The way the axle shafts are in here, they can actually pull out of the CV joint, I guess. I don't know what the technical term is, but the CV axles go into the shaft, and if the ends, the splines come out, you have to rebuild the whole thing because all the grease is going to come out and all the stuff that you need to be in there, it won't be in there anymore. So what I do is I actually lean it forward and then I kind of tilt it against the axle, and you can kind of see it engage. And right now it's okay. I wouldn't want it to go any more than what it is right now, but we just need enough room to be able to get this coilover out, so we're not going to angle it too much. We're going to attack the 3 bolts on top of the coilover. Furthest one back is very, very hard to get to, and it's very hard to get a good grip to actually loosen it. So let the battle commence. Now I got the 13 in my hand. I think it's 14, because I think 14 is yeah, it's 14. Hitting over on this side. What is that? So, oh, this is a 12.
There you go. It was in my pocket. It's nice and warm.
All I needed was a 14 millimeter wrench here, and it's in Trevor's pocket, so why wouldn't it be? So I always start in the back first, because that is the hardest one. Holy cow, that was easy. It is freely spinning off. I pull the rear end completely off. I take the second one completely off. Wow, the way my shirt was sitting there, I looked pregnant. So now that we have the 3 bolts on top of the coilover loosened up with one barely hanging on to catch the shock so it doesn't fall completely out, I'm going to loosen up the bottom bolt to the coilover to start the process of getting this thing actually completely out of the vehicle. I'm a little nervous how easily this side is coming apart, because something's got to give, and it's probably going to be the bolt coming out of the upper control arm. It's probably going to be the hardest thing to come out of this whole thing. Thanks to the pin, we got the lower coilover bolt out. So now we're going to convince this coilover that needs to come out. And basically all you're doing is working from the bottom. You're trying to lift it kind of up and out, and then we're going to lower it and then lift the top out. Holy cow, that was so much easier. All right, so now we're coilover wrestling.
Turn it this way.
Yeah.
Hey, just give you an update. We're about halfway through the front suspension. I want to take a moment to show you the differences between the stock and the Ironman 4x4 parts here. So on the upper control arms, they have just a bent steel. It's just folded over. Weight-wise, they're about the same, but as you can see, this is a lot beefier, but it's aluminum, so it's going to cut down the weight, but it's thicker and a little bit longer. One of the things that I really like about the Ironman 4x4 upper control arms is the fact that it's still using the factory ball joint. So no matter where you're at, you know, close to home, far away from home, you should still be able to get it readily available parts stores and Toyota dealerships. I think that is a huge plus over other ones that use proprietary. You may have to wait until a part gets shipped out to you, and then, you know, depending on where you're at, that could take a while. On the coilovers, it's a huge difference. The diameter of the bars is a lot larger. There's also more coils on the spring as well, and the coils themselves, I don't have a caliper, however, they even look fatter. So it's a huge difference, and the weight on these is significantly heavier than these guys. One of the other big differences in the shocks on these coilovers is the foam cell versus a gas shock. On the factory gas shock, it is normally nitrogen filled gas in there, so it's about halfway filled with oil, and then the rest is nitrogen gas to keep it from foaming up, so it creates a higher operating temperature than just the oil on its own. Where on the foam cells, it's fully filled with the oil, and then there's a piece of closed cell foam that acts as the pressure regulation on there. I don't know the sciences behind it, but it's something along there. And what it does is it gives you more volume of oil. It gives you, by being a larger shock, actually gives you more just volume of oil inside of it as well. Yeah, and that's pretty much the main difference between a nitrogen filled and the foam cell.
Oh, that was quick.
Ask you shall receive.
This bolt here, I'm going to stage in my mouth so that as soon as I get it up in there, it can be the first thing to go on. That way it will basically index the coilover so that it stays and doesn't want to fall out. So in the mouth it goes. You bitch. All right, we got the coilover in. That was definitely a lot harder than the other side was. I was trying to do it by myself so that my brother can get some pictures. However, it didn't work out that way. So I needed the second hand. I ended up having it inverted. It was rotated 180 degrees out. While Trevor is putting a liberal coating of anti-seize on the lower bolt of the control arm, I'm
in your shot, like right behind you, like just.
Are you smelling me? Oh, do I smell good?
It's just weird.
So while Trevor puts on a liberal coating of anti-seize on the lower bolt to the coilover, I am putting the 3 bolts on the top of the coilover on and tightening them down. That rear bolt is, as usual, being a pain.
There we go.
All right, so I know the awesome green color of the Ironman 4x4 coilover is beautiful, but we're going to cover it up with this ugly green towel in order to protect the powder coat. We don't want this thing to get scratched up when we're doing the upper A-arm swap. So now we're going to use 2 19mm wrenches to get off the single long bolt that goes through the entire upper control arm. And in order to start it, I'm going to end up using both. And all I'm doing is I'm taking these 2 wrenches and I'm going to take this one like this, and this one I'm going to go underneath it in order to get torque on this wrench. And it basically just extends the handle twice the distance of the wrench itself. Oh, it's got to put down. If you can grab it, can you or no? Huh? Can you grab it or no?
Yep.
I'm just gonna, hang on, I'm just gonna hold this washer here so it doesn't...
So there is a little bracket that is blocking the bolt from coming all the way out. It's holding the electrical wire coming up to the main battery terminal. I've got a Genesis dual battery system on here, so it's extended out a little bit further. With a factory battery, it should be no problem. Even with the Genesis, I'm able to get underneath the battery without removing it to pull it out.
So we got the upper control arm out, and now we're going to put in the new one. All right, so the upper control arm, when you put them in, you have to make sure you put them in completely perpendicular and level to the actual bolt holes, because these are cut so that the distance here is exactly the distance of the upper control arm assembly kind of deal. So when you put it in, it's got to go straight in, straight on.
Just ruined the video.
We just fought with that upper control arm for probably a good 10-15 minutes to get it on, to the point where we switched back. Trev gave it a shot. He couldn't get it on. We switched back. I grabbed it. I put it on. I was able to get it on after a few minutes of wrestling with it. That thing is a pain. And pro tip, when you're putting the bolt through, make sure the washer is already against it. Don't try to feed the washer through with the bolt. Put the washer on first and then put the bolt on. Otherwise, the washer will get hung up on the seam of the body panel. There. Still looks really good though. We got the long bolt through the upper control arm, and we're basically just going to make it a little snug, and we'll actually go back and tighten it all down once we get it on the ground on the tires. All right, nice and tight. I'm doing it. Yeah, I'm doing it. It's an Australian kit, so we're going to talk in a little Aussie today. So now we're going to reattach the spindle to the upper control arm. I put the castle nut onto the bolt of the ball joint, and now knowing that the angle is too far that way, I'm actually just going to use the castle nut itself on a wrench, and I'm just going to push down on this and pull up on this like a glove.
Wait, spacer.
Spacer. Ironman actually has a spacer, this spacer. So basically just it indexes the castle nut so that the cotter pin can fit through the hole. Finally got the castle nut on. We ended up having to lift up with the jack and then push down on the upper control arm to actually expose threads because of the spacer. It made it a little more challenging. So now all we're gonna do is put this castle nut on just enough so that it's tight, and we're able to get a cotter pin through the castle nut through the bolt. I think that's good. And now the cotter pin goes in.
So now that we got everything back together, we need to reattach the brackets for the brake lines. We're gonna start with the bottom bracket. I'll just hand tighten that for now. And then on the top one, the hole on the Ironman 4x4 control arm is a lot larger than the hole for the bracket. So we just have to drill out the bracket a little bit, and it's about 10 millimeters. Bend this out a little bit because it's wider than the factory. So when I bent out, it just kind of leaves a little bit of a gap. So hit it with a hammer a few times just to bend it back around. Gives it a cleaner look, and so nothing sharp is hanging out. Coming back and retightening the bottom with a 12 millimeter.
So I'm going through tightening up the top 3 bolts to the coilover because I only tightened one before we put the upper control arm on. These are the longest threaded bolts ever.
Alright, so I'm not sure if this is a thing or not. However, I've had a massive squeak, and you can see all along here where it's shiny metal. And I'm assuming that is where the squeak is coming from. So a quick little fix that I came up with is just getting some RTV and spreading it on all of those things. And what that's going to do is essentially create a seal between the gasket that's going on and the body. So hopefully it works.
The splash guard's installed, everything's all nice and tight. The only thing we have to do is we have to torque down on this and the bottom bushing once we get it on the tires. But now we have to reconnect the sway bar. And I want to show you guys the drop plates that they use on the sway bar to basically lower and then change the angle of the sway bar a little bit so that it actually doesn't connect with anything during wheel travel.
Well, hello. So we have our relocation bracket for the front sway arm, and it drops it down a little bit, but more importantly moves it forward to give more clearance for the larger coil, and mounts like this. Oh, we should probably undo the bungee. Just
Right now we are reinstalling the sway bar. We actually reinstalled the end of the sway bar where it goes into the spindle first on both sides, because the sway bar, the way it's built, it's got a lot of angles in it to get over things, and under here it's hitting on the radiator support bracket. So we ended up having to put these ends in first on both sides. That way it's easier to move the sway bar only in one direction, so it's got to go back and forth up here under the plate where the new mounting location is.
you can see over here that we have space in front of the coilover, so it's not going to impact on that. And yeah, now we are good to go.
Take two. Go ahead.
Hold on. We're going to go ahead and torque the sway bar before we get the tire on. Just gives us a little bit more room to operate. It is 70 Newton meters according to the Australian directions. So for us in the States, that would be 52 pounds of torque. Did you even tighten this?
I need a couple threads.
One down.
You gotta go. Oh, there it is.
Nice.
So the very last thing we need to torque down before we put it back on the wheels is the sway bar to the spindle. 52 pounds. That was nice. That was a nice feeling. So the Ironman 4x4 foam cell shocks, they come with 4 set screws, 2 on each ring of the rings that actually are on the shock itself. They're very fine thread. The set screws that are in here, they actually came very, very loose. One was about to fall out. So all we did was we basically went in with an Allen and we just snugged them down just so that they touched the threads. We didn't want to actually dig in and set that height. That way when it's all done and said, we're gonna go drive it for like 20 miles on some bumpy road. We're gonna come back, we're gonna measure everything out, and if we have to adjust the suspension, we're gonna loosen those set screws and we're gonna adjust it and then tighten them back down for good. All right, so we are done with the install of the suspension. Now we're putting the tires back on. And this is how I install wheels, especially tires and wheels that are oversized and getting heavy with a lot of rubber on them. I actually use my feet. I don't use my legs, I don't use my back, so I use my feet as kind of little hoists. You can actually lift it up like this with your feet, and you can actually move it over if I have to move it around. So now that I've got it centered over the lugs, all I do is lift it up with my feet and slide it on. And now I can just hold it here while I put the lug nuts on. When I'm doing the lug nuts, all I'm doing is I hand tighten them first, and I still do a cross pattern. So I do this side, then I do this side, and I go top again and one away, and then I go across to this side.
Great job.
All right, we've got the front end down on the ground, and now we're going to torque the bottom bolt to the coilover, and it should be 135 foot-pounds. Trying to torque the long bolt that goes through the A-arm. However, there is no way to get a torque wrench onto this. There's just no clearance. So I'm going to give it my very, very best guesstimation about the, what was the torque spec on it? I think it's 80 pounds. So between 50 and 80 pounds, I'm gonna make it happen. Nice and tight. So we have finished the front install, and now we're moving to the rear end, my favorite part. Working on the rear end. We've already removed, obviously, the wheel tire. We're working on the passenger side now. I just want to show you really quick before we go to the driver's side. We are on the driver's side. Before we go back to the passenger side, or second side we've been doing, I want to show you the track bar. We actually loosened the bolt to the track bar to be able to give our rear axle more droop so that we can actually get the springs out without having to compress them. We do have a coil spring compressor, I just don't really like to use it because they're kind of a pain. And we're also in the process of removing the sway bar. That will give us the same droop, same basic effect as removing the track bar, just more droop.
We're back with another benchtop discussion. Comparison between the rear end suspension. So these are the springs, they're upside down because they don't stand up well on this end, but you can kind of see the difference between the two. There's more coils again with the Ironman 4x4, but also the thickness is very apparent. Like, there's a good amount of heft to this, where this is, I mean, this is absolutely very light. Same with the shocks. The shocks, they're very different in the build. I pulled the included rock guard off with this, but you can see it looks shorter, but the amount of oil in this thing, because it is so large diameter compared to the factory one, and also it has a really good weld all the way around, and it's slightly offset, so it's mounted. So you got to make sure on your rear suspension that you have the driver's side and the passenger side in the proper areas. First things first, we need to make sure that we remove the bolt on the bottom of the rear shock. So we have the passenger side now, and before I was able to get a 17mm ratcheting socket on the top of the other end. However, on this one, the sheet metal is cut so close I can't get in there, so I have to use a crescent, and then I just have a pipe strap wrench to hold the bottom instead of trying to grip the top of the shock on this one. Not a lot of room in there. With the bottom of the shock bolt removed, let's take a hammer and smack it on the bottom of the shock to get it off. There we go. We've got both shocks out. Now we jacked up the opposite side and it lowers this side. With everything disconnected, the spring comes right out. Super easy. Let's see if I got the same stuff that Kelly's got. Dang it! All right, awesome. With the isolator on top, there's no big lip or anything on the isolator, so what I do is I just match it up to where the OEM spring was laying, so that way it's kind of just sitting in the same spot. And on the bottom, I make sure that there's no dirt in the bottom, and then I just sit it in and make sure it's at least a pinky's length or pinky's width from the metal, so that way it's not squeaking.
So this right here is the notch. Right now we have taken the floor jack and we have moved it off of the one side to create the space. We put it on the center and raised it up, making sure that both shocks are centered in the cups and centered in the bottom, one pinky width away from the flange there. So now we are in the process of reinstalling shocks.
So one more look at the Foam Cell Pro shock before we throw it in. Here you can see the offset at the bottom, where you get more space here than on this side. This area here is going to go closer to the axle, and this is going to be towards the front of the vehicle. And also you can see how the top hats are set up. Here's the setup for the bushings. The sheet metal is going to go in between here, but just to give you a good representation of how they're set up.
Trevor and I were really struggling getting these shocks actually tightened down to what they're supposed to be, because the problem is that everyone says use a pair of vice grips on top here, but the vice grips, when they went on, there wasn't enough room to get a wrench underneath them, and Trevor on the other side actually pretty much destroyed the whole top of the shock trying to do that. But I wasn't even able to get the wrench in there, the 19 mil wrench in there to do that. So I ended up finding a 1/4 inch wrench, and that actually fits on the head, and then I'm able to squeeze this underneath it.
Get a little anti-seize all over that, you know. Make sure it doesn't rust the bushing steel to this.
Keep going. Camera. Got our shock completely mounted on. The bottom bolt is in snug, and now we're going to reinstall the sway bar and then the track bar. Sway bar is back in. We're going to snug it down and then onto the track bar. Sweet. And that's how you have a two-person team of getting a sway bar in. One prying, one hammering. And now we're putting anti-seize on this bolt because you can never have too much anti-seize.
Anti-seize, anti-seize, all I see is anti-seize.
So I'm not sure which one it's called, either a panhard or a track bar. Not too sure what the difference is. Maybe it's the same thing. Either way, 96 pounds of torque. Lift is complete. Time to get the tires and wheels back on. Torquing at 86 pounds. Let's do it.
Lug nuts from heaven.
Oh boy.
Would you like a lug nut, little boy? Would you like it? Yes, there you go.
Yes, sir, may I have another?
Take your nuts. So we started this project around 11:30, and it is now 950. So we have definitely gone past our expected right around 6-hour mark that I kind of was expecting it would take. So right now we are quickly approaching the 11-hour mark. So definitely is a timely process, but with getting video, it definitely takes everything longer. Plus we're getting pictures and doing the whole documentation portion of this thing. But this was a great project. We are nearly done. Right after we get the last of the tires on, we're going to torque the wheels and tires. We still have to do one more thing on the front end. We found one of our set screws that had fallen out of the shock. We need to figure out where that came from and put it back in. And then we are going to drive around the block, bring it back. We're gonna measure everything out really quick. And then we're gonna go drive it around a little bit more. And then tomorrow we're gonna take it in for an alignment. And then Trev's getting new tires put on. So, lucky guy.
First impressions, I love this lift. So on-road handling, we've got better control. I feel like I have better steering. Overall handling is actually just improved over the stock suspension. Yeah, it just feels very stable. Love the suspension. The front end is absolutely perfect. It dips a little bit with braking, but very controllable, much better than before. Going around turns and stuff like that on the road, there's not as much roll. It soaks up bumps very well. It's not overly stiff or anything. It's, to me, like the perfect balance for on-road, off-road. The rear end, little stiff, but I kind of knew that. When I talked to Chris from Ironman 4x4, we had a when we calculated out my weights and everything that I'm normally going to roll with, I have a Overland trailer that attaches to this, so that adds quite a bit of weight. But I'm also going to be getting a drawer system put in the back, so very soon it should compress it a little bit more with the drawer weight, and it'll not be as stiff in the back.
So overall first impressions are very positive. Ironman 4x4 did a fantastic job building this kit. High quality build, every part of it was just amazingly high quality. So thanks again to Ironman 4x4. We'll see you guys in the next build.
Later.
Pull up someplace where we can
Get up and not get sand everywhere.
Camera meets dash.